Yep, you're good.
Okay. Awesome. My name is Josh Lofton. I'm the cropping system specialist here at Oklahoma State University. But I do have to say that I have to give a lot of credit to my graduate student, Anna Zander. A lot of this information that's going to be presented is some of her PhD work. And so a lot of the hard work that went into this is actually Anna's, but we'll kind of be jointly presenting this here today, and we're going to talk on if cover crops can be used as an effective weed management tool. So when we look at cover crops, and we have a whole section in winter crop school about cover crops, and we just got back from the ASA, the virtual ASA meetings, and I think every section I had or went into had a talk about cover crops. So we're almost getting the rock star, the new practice hype about cover crops in the last, going on nearly 5 to 6 years. And we're treating it like it's a new practice. However, all of us know that have been working in cover crops over the years know that it's a very historic practice. If you go back and read some of George Washington's journals, whenever he had his garden and his land, he explicitly stated that you have crops grown to sell, as well as crops grown to replenish the soil. Very, very near and dear to most people's hearts. Those journals there really talk about using the cover crops, but the history of cover crops goes back a lot further. Gets a little fuzzy on what it was used for back in the ancient Chinese and the Egyptian days and various other things, but a lot of them focused on using cover crops to improve less optimum soils. Kind of looking at those soils that weren't being productive and how they could make them a little bit more productive. I think in our field, in production agriculture, it's getting a lot more traction and a lot more visibility in this new practice hype because it was more extensive in more of our horticulture, some of our organic, small acreage farming, and it's just now becoming a big kind of thing in row crop production. It's not exclusive, but for a wide scale use in row crop production, it's becoming a little bit more visible. You pair that with the renaissance that we've been getting in all conservation practices with the soil health movement focusing on soil quality, and we're seeing the reason why there's so much hype around cover crops. So the question then becomes, why would anybody grow a cover crop? Well, there's several reasons, and when we talk to growers the first time wanting to grow cover crops, I think we should ask the first time is, what is your goals? What's your focus of the cover crops and your focus of your system, and what system are you wanting to grow it in? When I have a grower come up to me and they say, well, I heard a talk. Well, that's not why we decide to do a practice. We decide to do it because it is filling a goal or reaching a goal that we want to get with our system. And that's what we have to focus on first. Because we are in production ag and I am an agronomist, my first focus is yield. And I think even when we look at something that is not explicitly a yield practice, something that we aren't looking to improve yield on, we have to look at yield first, because we have to know how we will have to kind of manage or change our system if we do get better yields, maybe no difference in yields like Paul found, or maybe a loss in yield associated. So we have to look at yield first and really see how it's impacting it as a whole. And I'll just spend a little bit of time, so kind of looking in Oklahoma, how cover crops have affected yield in previous work. Kind of like Paul said, it's highly variable. Some years we get an improvement. Some years we get a net neutral. Some years is a net negative because of cover crops. It's very regional. Some regions see it a lot better than others. I know whenever I was in Louisiana, the part that I was in had a lot of benefits of cover crops because of the systems that we were in. However, you move into another system and they just didn't find those benefits because it was just a different system. So it's very regional focused. And it's very crop specific. We have a graph over to the right-hand side of the road. This is work done at Lahoma. They did a summer cover crop paired with 2 years of wheat, another summer crop, and then a year of milo. So kind of a 5-year system, a 5-year rotation. And this is the economic return on all 5 years, taking the variable input costs associated with the cover crops and the yield benefits, and the net increase gains from it. And we see that treatment 9 down there is our inorganic. So that would be a traditional managed system. All the other ones are cover crop field, and we see over a 4 to 5 year system that only treatment 1 or 2 increased over the more traditionally managed system. Probably is not going to be significant. We did not run the numbers on this, but the real reason for this is that number 3 and number 1 found a very significant increase in grain sorghum yields on that last year, while having a net neutral or net negative on the 2 previous wheat years. So really didn't see the benefit in the wheat, saw the benefit in the grain sorghum, and that's why we get a net benefit on a 5-year average because of a 1 in 5 years. So the question then becomes, will that work? Can we get a really big bump 1 out of 5 years and get a positive on the system and that work for us in our system? When we talk to growers about doing cover crops, the number 1 aspect, almost a quarter of the people that answered surveys have said that they need a monetary return on investment. Quite high. Actually, I expected it to be a lot larger, so it's a lot lower than I expected it to be. But still, over a quarter of the people wanted some sort of monetary gain on investment. And then when we look at ask the question of how many years would you be willing to have a net neutral or net negative impact due to a practice and still likely to implement it in future years, we're looking in between that 2 to 3 years is where we go from a more likely to implement to a more unlikely to implement situation. So we have that 2 to 3 years. So if we hit a home run in year 1 or 2, we could be in a good situation. But if we are in that situation like we were in the previous one, to where it was year 4 that we hit a home run, the grower might have already moved on from that practice and designated it as a unsuccessful practice. So what we have to do, because we do have those variable nature and yields, we have to look at our other benefits of cover crops, those other secondary benefits, because we need that short-term economic benefit that's gonna be there for them. And what I like to do is focus on benefits that provide some sort of tangible economic value. And we look at things like soil health. That is one that, I'm not going to talk about today. There's other people on this call that are vastly better at talking about soil health. However, some people can put a good economic value on it, and some people greatly struggle on how much 1% soil organic matter costs to them. What is that value? Something we have a lot easier to put potential on is daily gain if you integrate grazing. That is one of the things that I highly believe is one of the most value of cover crops, is providing that grazing potential in our cropping systems. However, there are some folks that just don't want cattle on their crop systems. They want cattle in their pastures and they want crops in their crop fields. So we can't really, hang our hat on either of those first two. The one that I'm going to talk more about today is improving agronomic management, specifically through improved weed management. And this is going to become a bigger and bigger issue. The more and more growing interest we have in weeds and weed challenges, and the more resistant weeds we have in our production systems. So if you take that 5,000-foot view on how cover crops can aid in weed management, very general discussion, 3 major aspects get talked about a lot. The first of which is being physical suppression, so just providing almost a barrier, kind of very similar to what we talk about cover crops doing from an erosion standpoint, like shielding the soil. Very similar benefits we get in a really heavy residue no-till system. What this is trying to do is allow that crop to get out of the ground, grow, and then provide almost a limitation to germination and early growth. That way, even if we do have weeds present, which most often we will, they're more easy to manage because they aren't rapidly growing and outcompeting that crop. Chemical suppression is one that's a lot less understood, but a lot more talked about. This is mainly through something you would consider like allelopathy. It's very difficult to determine if allelopathy is the main cause for a suppression or not. Because one, it's difficult to say, yes, it's definitely not physical suppression. It has to be allelopathy. And then even if you think it is, it's very difficult to ensure that there are the chemicals in the soil present to do that. So one that gets talked about a lot, however, one that I think we have years of work to really gauge if that has a major impact on some of our systems. Those two can both do it when the cover crops are in the field, as well as we move into that cash crop. one that is better when the cover crops are there, not as genuinely great when the cash crops in the field and cover crops are not, is resource competition. Basically, you're getting a cover crop to outcompete your weeds mainly in that fallow system. This is really good when we have some of our cover crops. However, we have weeds like pigweed and crabgrass and windmill tumblegrass and Johnson grass that are very competitive. And so we have to get very, very competitive cover crops to outcompete those competitive weeds. And more often than not, the more competitive it is, the more difficult it is to control at the end of the year. So we run a tight wire on that resource competition, get something that can outcompete our weeds that we can successfully manage in season. So I do have to add the caveat of just because it has been shown that cover crops may aid in weed management just doesn't mean that you throw seed out there, set it and forget it and walk away and say, I did a good job. You have to manage the crop. It's called a cover crop because it is a crop. You have to manage and plan around that cover crop. This can include what species or maybe mixture you put out there, seeding rate and planting date. Today, in the interest of time, I'm mainly going to focus on the species and the mixture composition that could be suitable. However, if we are looking at physical suppression, the things like seeding rate and planting date become very, very important because it's all about getting biomass out there to physically suppress. The other thing on seeding rate, kind of like Paul talked about a minute ago, is we can't outspend ourselves. I can put more seed in the ground and get better biomass, but I have to walk that line of being economic on my system and being able to manage weeds in the successive cash crop system. So we have to make sure we're not out farming ourselves on that one, but there is a kind of a wide road that we can do to be quite successful on that. So when we look at what we found in the state, how, getting to the question, can we use cover crops to actually use in an integrated pest management system for weed control? The first project we did, and I will add the caveat in here, I am going to focus on row crops because that's what I specialize in. And in the interest of time, I am going to focus on soybean. We have looked at this in corn. We have looked at it in grain sorghum, but I'm going to focus on soybean because one, we have the most information on it. But two, like I said, I want to stick to a crop. That way we can really dive down deep into it a little bit. The first project we looked at was up in the Northeast in Nowata County, looking at various cover crops. This was actually done after the fact. Jason Warren actually planted these cover crops. He was looking at it from a soil health perspective. And I came out to a field day to talk about drill calibrations, and I walked through the plots with Jason before the field day, and I said, Jason, I think we have something here. We really need to look at this as we go into the cash crop. And he agreed, and so we looked at it as the grower got to terminated, and then went into the successive cash crop, which was soybean. So we have various cover crops here. We have a mix or a slew of single species cover crops: rye, wheat, triticale, radish. This is that tillage radish that we're all familiar with, and winter pea. We also have a mix, which is everything in the tank. We have a rye radish pea and a rye pea here. Apology, that's a radish pea. And so we see at burn down, so this is 4 graphs. This is going to be at burn down, 1 month into the cash crop, 2 months into the cash crop, and then 4 months into the cash crop. The y-axis is the number of weeds in a meter squared across the board. So we see right here at burn down, this is right before the grower put the burn down and the pre-emergence herbicide out. And that is the last herbicide that was put on this field, was the burn down and the pre-emerge. We saw that, of course, where we had fallow ground to check where there was no residue. And I do have to specify, this was no-till behind corn. So there was residue, but there was no cover crop residue, had a significantly higher amount of weeds in that meter squared. It went down quite a bit, and we kind of get this big jumbled mess of most of our cover crops got into this middle range. Rye kind of snuck down to have the least amount of weeds when we went into that burn down system. When we went 1 month into the cover crop, we see the value of that pre-emergence herbicide. Really not relying on the cover crops at this stage in the game, but we are relying on that pre-emerge to kind of pair with those cover crops. We see that because the check still has quite a bit more weeds in a meter squared. And we see something, the kitchen sink and the radishes actually having a higher than the rest of the cover crops across the board as far as number of weeds in that meter square plot. So kind of almost has 3 tiered systems, a low tiered where you don't have a whole lot of weeds present, a medium tier, and then with the check, we have a high tier. Again, I will specify the grower did not put out any herbicide in season, thankfully, on these plots. We saw kind of a change in the guard in our weed types in this 2-month area to where we didn't have a whole lot of our summer weeds being established. But we still have some of our other cover crops like our rye, wheat, triticale, and our peas, and then some of our mixes holding on with a fairly low weed count. Radish is a little bit higher. Kitchen sink was a lot higher. And then we saw the check, at pretty much the most weeds in a meter square area. When we go to 4 months out of the season, we see those weeds kind of break. We are not happy with these weed numbers. However, we are seeing this distinct difference between some of our cover crops, namely the small grains and the peas, and then the pea and the radish there, kind of coming through as winners in this scenario, where by the time you get to this, the rye, radish, pea, the kitchen sink, and the radish, along with the check, have kind of all evened out across the board at fairly high weed numbers. So a couple of things that we learned from this first venture into looking at this is, one, can we use weeds as an effective weed management, or cover crops as an effective weed management? Sure. Yeah, it's definitely possible. And it's not just in the fallow season, it's in season as well. Another thing that we kind of caught on to is radish, because it winter killed so early in the year, didn't provide us that longevity as weed management and control in season. You see here, and as it gets into the later stages. And then 2 or 3, it's not a forever treatment. We have to use this as part of a successful weed management program. Can't just be a standalone option. So we kind of, and I will add the caveat in here, is that there's actually a publication saying that biomass, the amount of biomass you produce, is more important than species you have out. I agree with that to a point, but I would argue that based on the information we found in this study. We see the pictures to the right. These are fallow that didn't have any cover crop planted. You see the amount of weeds that we have here, mostly henbit, some mare's tail, volunteer corn. You see that it isn't a no-till system. You see this kitchen sink here does have the amount of weeds coming in. This is our rye. This is bulk rye, just planted as a single species. Basically nothing. And you can see on the outside of this area, I wasn't cherry picking on this. This is basically how the plot looked. So we see a value here, and this is not a great rye stand for mid-March, mid-April, when we were going to plant that successive crop. Our next one was more of a current, and this is what my student is working on right now. As we talked to a lot of growers and said, rye is kind of your best option. Well, wheat production being what it is, a lot of growers said, I don't want to plant rye. Let's plant wheat as the cover crop. Okay. So this study is looking at what's the best companion for wheat, and if we go into a mix. So we got wheat is a component of all these cover crop treatments. So we have wheat rye oats, wheat canola, wheat buckwheat, wheat sun hemp, wheat chicory, and then a kitchen sink that has everything. So this is cover crop biomass. So we have grams of biomass here on the y-axis, or cover crops here. This is right at termination. And we see that we have between our wheat rye oats, wheat canola, wheat buckwheat, and the kitchen sink has the best or the highest amount of biomass accumulated right at termination, where the fallow, of course, didn't have any cover crops. Sun hemp and chicory did not have a significant amount of cover crops available. When we look about the weeds right at termination, it's just inverse of how much biomass we had out there. The fallow, highest amount, we had a significantly less, but still significantly higher than our other cover crops with our sun hemp and our chicory. And then all of our other cover crops kind of being down here at this even kill. But it's not just how many weeds are out there, it's what weeds are out there, what weeds are present. And because some weeds, we all know some weeds are harder to kill than others. So my student actually looked at what weed types were out there, and we see that these letters do indicate significant difference within the specific weed type. So this A and this BC does not mean there's significant difference here. What this does mean is this BC means that they're significantly lower in the henbit compared to the sun hemp wheat in this fallow. What we saw in the fallow is that we did see a lower amount of henbit, but our cutleaf evening primrose is what gained the highest amount of biomass in that weeds section. We had a little bit less of the henbit compared to our sun hemp and chicory, but universally across the board, our other cover crops, wheat, rye, oats, wheat, canola, wheat, buckwheat, and the kitchen sink did a lot better at controlling all of our species of cover crop with the weeds than our other cover crops, with the exception of grass that really did not have a major role here at this site location. And this is just kind of a visual of this. I think this is a great photo. This is one of our fallow plots here, and you see the weeds as we go kind of into the spring, and you see one of our wheat, rye, oats, I think, cover crop mixes here, and then you see a top-down view of it over here. You can really see the difference in how much value we can have in these cover crops, even if we don't have the best of stands and even if we don't have the biggest growth. This is not a big, bushy growth, but it's still getting us really good weed control. So in season is just as important, and we have to look at is how far we can stretch in season. And you see we did get some differences there from a visual basis. But when we actually look at the numbers, it's quite variable. We see this is a weed rating, 1 to 10 rating, where 1 is the best, 10 is the worst. Sorry about the 0 there. But when you look across the board, our fallow was the highest or was relatively high at 1 and 2 months following planting. However, some of our cover crops, specifically our canola and our sun hemp, and to a degree, pretty much across the board, still had significant weeds in the field compared to the fallow treatment at that 1 and 2 months, and basically everything bottomed out. So I kind of drew a box here, especially around the canola, which had a good amount of weed control in the fallow season. Why did it have such poor weed control in season? And that's because I told my student when we went out and we did fall counts, if the cover crop was still there and we did not successfully terminate it, it's considered a weed. And so we see here with the canola, we changed to canola because our tillage radish was dying in the winter. Our canola won't die in the winter, but it also is a Dickens to kill in the spring. And so we saw we had a tremendous amount of canola biomass, and we see the sun hemp plots as well. To me, these are weeds. This is not a cover crop anymore. This is weeds because I want that to be a soybean field. So still having an issue with some of our cover crops that are our best weed control ones and our best for yield, having an issue with them hanging around into our cash crop season. So I'll finish this off, and once again, another great picture you can see here with the henbit and the difference in the cover crops. Some take-homes: can cover crops be used in an integrated weed management system? Absolutely. They can't be standalone, though, at least in soybean. Maybe in corn, maybe in some of our other ones that get that really quick early season spring growth. But in soybean, not a standalone. We can use this as a practice that may relieve one of our in-season applications, but probably can't totally omit in-season herbicides at all. Grasses are often more difficult to kill than broadleaves, but we do have difficulty with different broadleaf species than others. Pigweed is particularly difficult to kill with some cover crops or manage and kind of keep down with that physical suppression compared to something like a henbit. Our winter covers, broadleaves are very difficult to manage because of winter kill. And when they don't winter kill, they become very difficult to manage when you get into that cash crop. We have shifted our recommendation from our tillage radish to canola to just keep that residue present in the field. You know, we still have challenges with the canola. And I'll finish off by saying that, and I might offend some people here, and that's okay. Cover crops are only cover crops when they're where they want, when they're where we want them to be. Otherwise, they're weeds. And if we can't kill them and terminate them going into our cash crop, to me, they're just weeds in the field. And that becomes very difficult to manage in successive seasons. With that, I'd like to thank the Oklahoma Soybean Board and NRCS CIG for funding a lot of this project, as well as a lot of the stuff my students doing, the Oklahoma Ag Experiment Station for allowing us to grow weeds on the station. My contact information, and Brian, I might be able to take one while Gail's getting ready. If not, I'll be here for the Q&A.
We'll have time for one question. If anybody has one before we go to Gail. Anybody have a burning question?